At FIE, we're not just
students
and faculty.
We're not only learners
and lecturers.
We are expanding minds,
Expanding futures.
We're redefining the classroom.
We are life-changing.
eye-opening. We are a community
Driven by our values.
That wants you.
you.
Yes, you.
To join.
Hello and welcome to In the Field, a podcast from FIE where we will be exploring all things study abroad. I'm Dr. Heidi James Dunbar, writer in residence and senior faculty, and I will be your host. Joining me today is Dr. Jane Levi. Jane is a cultural historian specialising in food history and utopian politics. Following a successful business career, she completed her PhD at King's College London and now works as an independent consultant, writer and educator. A visiting research fellow at KCL, Jane was their Mount Vernon Fellow in 2018. Passionate about communicating with audiences outside the academy, she regularly delivers workshops and lectures for cultural institutions, bringing this creative, accessible approach to her teaching. She was a Delphina Foundation Associate Artist in 2016, co-founder of Edible Utopia, an artist growing cooperative at Somerset House, London, from 2016 to 2021, and guest curator of Feeding the 400, a food exhibition for the Foundling Museum in London, which won funding from the Wellcome Trust. Jane is chair and trustee of the Sophie Coe Prize in Food History and a trustee of the Oxford Food Symposium. She was born in Wales, grew up in Scotland, and has been resident in London for more than 3 decades, where she serves as a magistrate. Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've got so much to talk about: food, utopian politics, being a magistrate, and the South Korean Biennale. But let's start with what inspired you on your career path? What got you going?
Well, I suppose, like lots of people, I've always loved food. My family was always very interested in food. My mum and my grandma were great cooks. My dad used to take us out to restaurants, which, you know, given my age, was more unusual thing back then. He would always take us to restaurants. He wouldn't let us order something that we'd eaten before. So I was encouraged to experiment and try and like new things from whenever I was a child. And I just always really appreciated how important food was in making friends and relaxing after school, or getting to know people, or being sociable. We were always having people around to our house to eat. And so food always felt very important and was really interesting. And I've always been a great reader, always loved reading, and started discovering cookery writers who weren't just writing recipes, and realizing food was also a really interesting way of looking at the world in general, and reading and thinking. But I didn't really think anyone else was interested. Oh, and I loved history as well. So all those things went together. And then a friend of mine published his first book and had a big party to launch it in Waterstones in Bath. That's where he lived. And he said, please come to this party, but please drive to Bath and collect these friends of mine on the way, because they won't be able to come unless you drive them to Bath. So I went to collect these friends of his, and it turned out to be Alan Davidson and his wife, Jane. And Alan Davidson, for many of us, is like the godfather of food history. He founded the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. He had a quite eccentric but rather fabulous publishing company called Prospect Books that published a journal and facsimiles of historic cookbooks and all sorts of really what were then quite niche things to do with food, and now are much more mainstream. And what his real talent was for, he was a brilliant thinker. He was really fun, and he really built community. So he founded all these things that brought lots of us who had these eccentric interests that we didn't think anyone else shared, brought us together. And that sort of got me much more into really doing some actual work and starting to recognize that food can be an academic pursuit as well as, a matter of survival and the everyday or having a party or whatever it is. That food genuinely is an important thing to think about.
I think I'd love to hear a bit more about that, about what food can tell us, because, as you say, it's something that we all can take for granted. We love it, it's essential, and it's one of those things
or
that
we hate it and we have terrible problems with it, or
right,
it
absolutely,
can be a source of real agony for some people.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose, I'm biased, and I do use it as my way of looking at the world. But it really is, it's everything. You could argue, you can use food as the subject in an economics class. If you're studying agriculture, if you're thinking about medicine or any, particularly, nutritional science, but really any aspect of anything to do with your body, it's a socioeconomic issue, it's a social issue, it's a public health issue, it's about trade, it's a component of history, colonialism, empire, how does one thing get from one place to another? Why do we eat what we eat in the combinations we eat it in? So yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental to everything. It's one of the things that every single human being has to somehow have access to throughout their entire life. And I think that's part of the reason I put it together in my main research with the idea of utopianism, because it sounds a bit bonkers and odd on the surface. But the way I think about it is that food is fundamental to everything, but completely mundane in one way. We've just got to have it. But at the same time, it's this source of great pleasure, potentially, great opportunities for sharing and building community and dreaming of something amazing that you might be able to have in the future or special occasions. So it's these extremes in a way. And I think about utopianism in the same way that, people think of utopias as being, completely fantastical and imaginary and impossible, perhaps. It's, for some people, it's like a synonym for a stupid idea or a crazy, impossible idea. But if we're thinking about real, practical utopianism, if that's even a phrase, it's really thinking about how you can make life better. And it could be in a really small way. I read something once that said that, all really radical ideas or all really good ideas for social or political change started off as utopian ideas. The idea that women should be allowed to vote was an insane utopian idea for centuries. And now that it's in place, we wouldn't dream of thinking it was utopian. So utopianism is this sort of combination of the mundane, because once you've done something, you've got to think about the next thing, and what you're doing is just what you're doing. It's practical, everyday, boring life. but it's also a place where you can imagine what else is possible, what could be better, and try and do it. So in my slightly odd way, I put the two together, use food as a way of thinking about those possibilities for the world.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. As you say, it's something we all need. And why not be idealistic and utopian in thinking about how we can make food absolutely accessible?
Yeah.
Good food accessible
Exactly.
to all.
And dream about how we can solve, if we're thinking about all our climate challenges, agriculture and food supply, water supply is so fundamental to all of that. And we really do need to think of something insane to fix it all, and make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a little bit about the course you teach at FIE. That's on food, right?
Well, I love it. It's such a great course. I inherited it from our wonderful colleague, Julie, but have adapted some parts of it to make it more mine. We basically introduce students to the idea that food studies, food history, socioeconomic aspects of food are legitimate areas for academic study. They, although food studies now is a key component in lots of universities, it's still relatively new, and it used to be thought of because food is very mundane and everyday and domestic and female and about cooking and using your hands, not your brain. It's traditionally been thought of as, not really a proper topic. So
unless you're a male chef, right? Unless you're a male chef.
Yes.
Women are cooks, men are chefs, or certainly in the,
Yeah, are you a chef
past.
or a cook? Yeah. And I think, an awful lot of people now are sort of reclaiming that idea of the honor in being a cook, and rather than claiming to be a chef and running a kind of military operation. I mean, that's where all that language of the kitchen originally came from. It's a big brigade of all these different levels of job title for men. So we talk about all those kind of things. So we talk about, why food is a legitimate area for study, because it's a study abroad program in London, in the UK. Then we focus quite a lot on British examples, and use it as another way, I suppose, to complement some of the core classes in thinking about what is Britain and what is Britishness, and using food as a way of really delving into those questions, and developing a deeper knowledge of sort of current culture and historical events that have led to where we are today.
Remind me what the name of the course is again?
It's called Food, Society and Culture in Britain.
Brilliant, thank you. And you get to sample things, right? You do get to eat sometimes.
Yeah. We try. I mean, we try to eat as much as possible, but I have to be, very clear that I'm not going to force feed anyone with anything. But there are lots of opportunities to taste things. So, and some of that happens in the classroom, and some of that happens outside the classroom. So we do quite a lot of co-curricular visits, and they're quite different from one another. So, 1 week we'll be having a super fancy afternoon tea, because tea is so important to all those histories of Britain. And then this morning, actually, we had a class, and we went to Brixton in South London and did a tour of that area. And we were thinking about, the Caribbean immigration into the UK and what impact that has on the food that's available and the culture in that part of London, and also thinking about gentrification and what that means for for people's culture and socioeconomic status and the price and availability of food, all of those questions. And because the students have already done a project in Borough Market, which is kind of the opposite extreme, really, and also spent some time, researching what's going on in supermarkets and in fancy food halls in London, they can really start to go to those different parts of London and the UK, and when they travel to Europe, and really sort of think about what they're seeing and, who's participating, who are these things really for, who's being excluded as much as included, and what does all this that we're seeing and partially experiencing tell us about the culture that we're in? How can we I suppose use this as a way of thinking about the world and really trying to immerse ourselves in it, not just as consumers, but as sort of thoughtful participants.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Now, I'd really love to hear about your time in South Korea at the Biennale. I know you were co-curating there, so can you tell us about that project?
No,
it was collaborating. Sorry, you were collaborating.
I was not curating at all. So, I was traveling with one of the artists who had a piece in the Biennale. So in Southwest Korea, there's a city called Gwangju, and they started having a Biennale 30 years ago. So this was the 15th one. So it's become huge. And, they built this enormous exhibition hall. And in fact, they've decided it's not big enough. I mean, it was massive, and they're going to build another one. And every 2 years, they have this huge art exhibition. So they have the Central Hall, which is a sort of core exhibition that's put together by a French curator at the moment called Nicolas Bourriot. And he has a big team of sub-curators who look after different groups of artists, and they set a theme every time. And this year the theme was it was a Korean word called pansorai, which is a 17th century Korean sort of song and storytelling tradition, and apparently roughly translates as being the voice of the people. So the idea of the exhibition was that there would be a lot of soundscapes as well as visual work, just thinking about how we can reflect on, the modern Anthropocene and what are the soundscapes of the 21st century, and where are we going, and how do we address the many issues that we're all thinking about at the moment in the world. So the artist that I went with, I had worked with him on the text that goes with the work. Because I am not an artist. I occasionally can feel I can claim to be a writer, but I'm not a visual artist. And so, because there's an awful lot of thought that goes into these pieces, especially when it's a big exhibition with this big thematic process, and people are invited by the curators, who know artists and their work and think, they're talking about issues that mean something in this context. So the work that he'd made or had proposed, and actually, basically mostly made on the spot in the exhibition hall, was a sculptural piece with sound and with smell, with scent. So it's a sculptor who works with sound and scent. And it was, the sound piece was recordings of winds in different deserts around the world. And the visuals were sort of words associated with this idea of winds as being, migratory forces. So the winds are moving around the world in extraordinary patterns, moving material, helping birds travel thousands of miles, insects. And yet we have, as humans, all these hang-ups and rules and horrible things happening associated with human migration, and yet nature is doing this constantly all the time. So he'd made a sort of symphony, really, of these different winds from different parts of the world. And it was a sound piece for wind, dust, and breath. And there were some beautiful paintings of butterflies as well. So a combination of elements. So it took quite a while to put it all together on site, which was a very interesting process to observe and help hang bits of paper off bamboo frames occasionally. But I was more of an observer than anything else while I was there. But yeah, I'd been involved in just helping to shape the words that went around it.
That sounds absolutely fascinating, because obviously wind itself can sculpt things.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
From trees being leaning in a certain direction because the wind blows in that direction,
Yep.
or even how rock formations and things are gently eroded and sculpted by winds.
Absolutely.
There's something quite lovely about making a sculpture or a sort of multimedia piece. It's about wind that is, sort of referencing its own self. There's something really interesting about that.
Yeah, it really is. And and I suppose, and also having the scent element, because that's so important in terms of food. One of the things we talk about in the course is, what is taste, what is flavor, and actually how much more important your sense of smell is for what you taste than your tongue. So, and what impact your sense of smell has on your sort of sense of well-being and your memory and all of these things that we experience in all aspects of our lives, but why food is comforting, and why you might walk down the street while you're on a study abroad program and suddenly feel terribly homesick because you just smelt something that is like your granny makes. So yeah, I suppose I enjoyed very much that kind of the smell element coming into that kind of artwork, because it sort of speaks to how I experience things as well.
Yeah, and of course, scent is carried in the air.
Well, that's true. Yes. Yeah. The breath, the wind. Yeah. Absolutely right.
Yeah. I always ask our guests about their city secret. Do you have a city secret you would be willing to share with us?
Yeah, I love sharing those kind of secrets, especially when they're linked to food. So, and actually the students are always asking me this, and I'm really bad at answering the question, but you made me think about it. So they will thank you as well. They always want to know where to get good fish and chips, which is an excellent
of course.
question. And I've got 2 suggestions for fish and chips in London. One is for if you want to actually go out for a meal and sit somewhere comfortable, but not, a Michelin-starred restaurant. It's very straightforward, very old-fashioned British, kind of carpet and photographs of trawlers on the walls. It's called the North Sea Fish Restaurant, and it's in Bloomsbury. It's quite near the British Library, that sort of area. It's great, and they cook brilliantly. They're proper fat chips, and you can choose your fish. And they probably sometimes make a nice fish soup as well if you want to be a bit fancier. But that's a really great one if you want to sit down somewhere comfortable. If you want to go to a proper old Formica countered chippy, then the fabulously named Friar's Delight which actually isn't very far from the North Sea. We'll have to look it up, but it's also in Bloomsbury near Chancery Lane.
Yeah.
Sort of area. So the Friar's Delight. And then the other thing they don't ask me about, but I sometimes just send them anyway, is an old-fashioned greasy spoon calf. And there is one that almost all food people I know would recommend as the classic, which is called the Regency calf. And it's sort of near Westminster. So it's quite central, but a little bit tucked away round a corner. It's sort of between Westminster and Tate Britain, that sort of area. And yeah, it's just great. It's perfect. It's a bit better known than it used to be. So there's always a queue. And if you can't be bothered to wait in the queue, there's another one opposite. And its name escapes me, but all the cabbies go there.
Which is a sure sign of London quality if the cab drivers are going. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think they used to go to the Regency and they just got fed up with all the tourists going there, but and others in general. Yeah. But yeah, either one of those.
I always try to recommend to students when they ask about food to either go find some good fish and chips, but they have to get a fry up for breakfast at a greasy spoon. There's nothing beats. It's like medicine. If you're feeling a bit ropey in the morning, get yourself a full English fry up. And then, of course, a good curry.
And even if you're not.
Everyone deserves a fry up every now and then. Yeah. They're brilliant. That's fantastic. So you see, I will put the links and directions to these places in our show notes. But thank you so much for joining me, Jane. That was wonderful speaking with you.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To learn more about our faculty, courses and programmes, visit our website www.fie.org.uk. And if you've enjoyed this episode, check our others out wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. FIE provides life-changing study abroad experiences in the UK, Ireland and Spain. As a non-profit educational organisation, we are passionately invested in making a difference for our students as the future global leaders of tomorrow and the field of international education as a whole. The FIE podcast is a creative and academic space for exploring everything, the people, the places and opportunities that make your experience so valuable and exciting.
FIE, we're here to help you
Unlock a wider,
brighter future.